The first song my kid tonight was Will You Walk With Me? And that's really what communion is about. Walking with Jesus. You know, sometimes we really don't take communion as seriously as we should. We sort of put it down as a ritual, which comes every once in a while, rather than the serious meaning that it actually has. In the early church, it was said in Acts that every day they continued to meet, and they broke bread in their homes. Yes. Every day. There was not a minister or a priest or a rabbi there. They just did it because they wanted to honor Jesus. And even in the Middle Ages and earlier this century, communion was taken much more seriously. In many churches, you had to actually prove yourself before you could take communion. By your activities, by your conduct, by your manners. And if you did this, the minister would then give you a communion token, which you then had to put in the communion plate to receive communion. And after the communion, the process would start all over again. And this just wasn't in Europe. This is a communion token from the Knox Church here in New Glasgow, about 100 years ago. We sometimes don't take communion very seriously, and some people don't even want to take communion because they think it represents a type of morbid activity where you eat the blood, or eat the flesh and drink the blood of something. And that's not what it's really meant to be at all. Because, like everything else in the Bible, there's allegory behind it. And it really goes back to the Passover, but more so to the time in the wilderness. It said when Moses led the Hebrews into the wilderness, they entered the desert or the wilderness of sin. It's a desert we're all in. It says in Romans that no one is righteous, no, not one. Therefore, we're all in the desert of sin. And there were two facets that the people really required in that desert. One was food, and one was water. The same things that everybody today need. And they complained to Moses about leading them into the desert where there was no food. And so God provided them manna from heaven. And it says, in John, it says, our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness. God gave them bread out of heaven to eat. They required this manna for sustenance. It gave them life. It gave them physical nourishment. But it also says that those who ate manna in the wilderness eventually died. You see, Christ said that He was the bread of life. He was the bread that gave you spiritual life. In Ephesians it says that you who were dead, He made alive. So the idea of communion, the bread is the bread of life, not necessarily the body of a person. It's really the bread of life. And it's the bread that takes people from death to life. It's the bread that comes from heaven that gives you spiritual nourishment, the same as manna gave the Hebrews physical nourishment. And then the water. It says that when the Hebrews were in the desert, they were thirsty, they cried for water. So that Moses would strike the rock and water would come forth. Now, water, we take water into our bodies, but it doesn't stay as water. it is made into blood. Blood is red. When Christ had his first miracle, he changed water into wine, which is red. So wine obviously symbolizes the blood of Christ in a way that it gives nourishment and gives life to people. Jesus told the woman at the well that he was the living water, and he who drank that water would never die. So when we take communion, we have to understand we're taking the bread of life and the symbolism of water and blood, because the life is in the blood, as it says in Leviticus. We take sometimes communion very casually, and we sometimes don't understand how deep a meaning there is to it. It says in Corinthians that people would not come necessarily to church for communion, but they would come sometimes for food. They would not take the communion altogether, that they would come for food. Now, obviously they must have served more than Peter serves us, but this was part of the reason. And it says in Corinthians 12, there should be no schism in the body. There should be no disagreement in the body. There should be no contentiousness. Okay? There should be no problems when you come to communion. It says, when you assemble yourselves together, if you have contentions, if there is factions among you, it is not possible to eat the Lord's Supper. It says, do you not have houses to eat and to drink in? Is this, for I received of the Lord, which I delivered unto you, that the Lord took the bread and the wine the night he was betrayed. And everyone took it together. It also says that if you eat the bread or drink the cup in an unworthy manner, you shall be guilty of the body and the blood of Christ. Let a man prove himself. For he that eats and drinks judgment unto himself if he eats and drinks unworthily. For this cause many among you are weak and sickly, and a few sleep. Communion is not something we should take lightly. It is not something we should just slough over. It is not something that does not have deep meaning. And there is deep symbolism in it. For when you have communion, it means that Christ walks with you. And you have been made alive, those who have been dead. So as we take communion tonight, I know Peter has something to say, but let's consider both this and his words, and give us all something to think about.